In this first video, we're going to come to a subject we'll come back to time and time again. Subject of scripture and how we read it, how we understand it, how we interpret it. In the preface, I talk about two fixed points, which I'm very comfortable with, one being regarding the cross of Christ, and the second one related to that, obviously, because that's where we learn about the cross of Christ, is the authority of scripture. Now, we're well aware two people reading the same text can read it very differently. So I want to provoke or maybe try to explain a little bit of where I'm coming from and to provoke you as you approach scripture as well. I think if you come from they call it a strict evangelical background, then sometimes we view God as very restrictive and almost like step outside the box and right on the border will be the Bible, like a guard dog saying, "Don't go any further." Now we have to get rid of that idea. One, we follow Jesus, who turned the ideas about the Jewish God inside out and upside down, and even challenged their reading and understanding of their holy books, their holy scrolls. You've heard it said, but I say to you. Now, we can argue all day long he didn't contradict the Old Testament. Absolutely. But if you're a hearer, it must have sounded as if that is exactly what he was doing. And we've got to be willing to go there to realize that Scripture is not a restrictive book, but it's an invitation to explore. One of the words that is used to Scripture is it is useful. All Scripture is God breathed. And people fight forever over what does that mean in inspiration, what kind of level of inspiration does it mean inerrant just as originally given, etc., etc., etc. But all scripture is God breathed and is useful. It has to prove to be useful to us to provoke me in my discipleship, my following of Jesus. So that's where I want to start. Now, when we come to scripture, I do not want to get rid of what I would call inner conflicts, inner discussions, inner even disagreements, certainly different perspectives. It's part of the creative nature of the book, and we've got to allow it to, I almost said contradict itself, and maybe at times it almost does, but certainly conflict with another piece of writing within the same book, because it's in the creativity. It saves us from going to one extreme or another, try to hold intention and to come out of it with our particular perspective. For example, creation stories, two of them, and they do not line up exactly. And we mustn't think that the original writers, editors were naive and couldn't see their discrepancies. They were fully aware of that. There's day before there's a sun and a moon. All ancient people know that the sun marked the day and the moon marked the night. So we mustn't try to put on scripture what is not intended to be there. Those chapters are not some kind of scientific journal that we have to work through. They're a piece of literature that are much more profound than any piece of scientific journal could ever be. I think Paul, for example, probably did believe in a literal Adam and Eve. I personally do not. And I don't see that as a conflict. Am I in disagreement with Paul? I'm in disagreement with what I think Paul would have thought. However, I think if he lived in my world today, he probably also wouldn't think of a literal Adam and Eve. The issue is not the historic reference that we're trying to make work or not work there. It is what is the theology that is coming through. That is what's much more important. Take the story of Nineveh. There's no city in the ancient world, very few cities today, that would take 3 days to cross. So at that level, no, it's factually inaccurate. But it is saying 3 days to cross it for a very good reason. And we mustn't get hung up on is this, is that, but try to dig into it and how do we read it. Scripture is essentially a piece of narrative. Even the law, the 5 books of the law, how much of it is thou shalt not and thou shalt this? No, it isn't that. It's stories of the patriarchs, stories of the people of Israel journeying. Why? Because Torah is not about do's and don'ts. What's it about? It's about a pathway for life. And where do we learn about that? We learn about it essentially through the lives of others who have sought to follow after God, and whether we can follow in their footsteps or learn from their mistakes. And that's the heart of Torah. Now, there are laws in there, don't do this, etc. But the vast majority of it is narrative. And I will try to take a narrative approach when I come to scripture. So I want us, as we approach these Zooms, not to get caught up in the text says this or the text says that, and pull one out that suits us. I guarantee you, for every text that suits me, there'll be three or four that doesn't suit me. And as I say to people, all theology leaks. None of it is watertight. I just happen to think mine leaks less than theirs do. But if I assume mine doesn't leak at all, I really am going to be disappointed and disappoint others. So I really welcome you on this journey. And for sure, we're going to come back again and again to this issue of scripture, how we approach it, and why I approach it with what I would term a historical narrative approach. So I hope you enjoy the Zoom course.